The train gave a long sigh as it slowed into Union Station, the brakes hissing like an old man clearing his throat before saying something important. Ludacris sat still for a moment, eyes fixed on the station's high-arched ceiling as it came into view through the smudged window. At 82, his body moved slower, but his memory was sharp, even cruel sometimes. He adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt beneath the worn but freshly pressed brown wool blazer. His slacks hung a little loose these days, and the shoes on his feet gleamed with fresh polish, not for anyone else, just for him. That's how he was raised. You show respect by showing up right. He stood carefully, using the armrest for balance. The overhead lights flickered as passengers grabbed bags and prepared to leave. Across the aisle, a woman in her 30s offered him a warm smile. "You visiting family, sir?" she asked kindly. Ludacris gave her a small nod, his eyes gentle but distant. "A friend's funeral," he replied. Her expression softened, her smile fading into sympathy. "I'm sorry." Ludacris tipped his brown felt hat slightly, signaling the end of the exchange. There was nothing more to explain. Not today. As he stepped off the train and onto the platform, the air met him with the crisp bite of a Washington morning. The scent of diesel clung to the wind, mixed with coffee from a nearby vendor cart and something sweet, maybe cinnamon buns. Ludacris breathed it in slowly. He didn't come for the city, but it felt good to arrive. The noise around him was sharp, bustling, alive. He walked with a steady, stiff gait. Years of mopping hallways and scrubbing floors at Langston High in Birmingham had left his knees and back aching, but he never missed a day of work. Not even when the school forgot to replace the broken heater in winter. Not even when they forgot his name at the retirement party. He only took off 1 week, when his wife passed. Now, it was just him. No kids. No siblings. Just faded photos in his wallet and a promise made in a rice field 57 years ago. He waited patiently in line for a taxi, gripping the handle of his old leather bag. A young man in a navy hoodie cut in front of him without looking back. Ludacris said nothing. He simply waited his turn. When the cab finally came, he climbed in slowly and gave the driver an address, Arlington National Cemetery. The cabbie glanced at him through the rearview mirror, chewing gum and raising an eyebrow. "Big service today, right? 4-star general, I heard." Ludacris nodded once. "He was a good man," he said simply. The driver didn't ask more questions, and Ludacris didn't volunteer answers. He stared out the window as the cityscape gave way to monuments, tree-lined avenues, and rows of waving flags. His mind drifted, as it always did when he thought of Thomas Becket. They met on Montgomery Road in Tuskegee, Alabama, back in '49. One was the preacher's son, the other a janitor's boy from the mill houses. But kids didn't care much about titles back then. They became inseparable. Playing stickball until dark, splitting popsicles in summer, getting into scuffles over nothing and swearing lifelong loyalty by the time they turned 12. And they kept it. Through war. Through silence. Through everything that came after. The cab rolled to a stop near the south gate of the cemetery. Ludacris handed over a $20 bill. The driver offered to help with his bag, but he waved him off politely. The moment he stepped onto the curb, his breath caught. Not because of the rows of polished white stones stretching across the hills, or the long black hearse resting under the green canopy up ahead. It was because the air shifted. This was sacred ground. The kind where silence said more than sound. Men in uniform stood tall and still. Guests in dark suits filled the rows of white chairs. Ludacris adjusted his collar, reached into his blazer, and took out a neatly folded envelope. The cursive on the front was clear, "Mr. Ludacris, please escort to front. Sincerely, Rebecca Becket." He stared at it for a long second, then returned it to his coat and stepped forward with quiet purpose. Nobody noticed him. Not yet. But that was fine. He didn't come for recognition. He came because of a promise. A promise made in blood, smoke, and mud when the jungle was screaming and men were dying. He came because no one else pulled Thomas Becket out of that trench but him. And now, he would walk beside him one last time. As he moved toward the entrance, Ludacris didn't see the whispers yet to come, the resistance, or the salute that would stop everything. All he knew was that he had arrived. He was here. He had shown up. Because that's what brothers do. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ludacris moved with slow determination, every step toward the cemetery's gate a silent defiance of time and circumstance. His body had grown stiff over the years, but his spine stayed straight, and his chin lifted. He wore dignity like a second skin. The kind forged not in fame or accolades, but in years of steady work, quiet sacrifice, and choices no one noticed but that mattered all the same. As the rows of headstones stretched out before him in their perfect military precision, he paused for a moment, letting the full weight of where he was sink in. Arlington was not just a place of rest. It was a ledger of service, a place where stories too big for tombstones lay beneath the earth, held together by folded flags and final salutes. He pressed onward, adjusting the strap on his bag, feeling the curve of the envelope Rebecca had given him resting against his chest. Her handwriting was delicate, almost old-fashioned, the way women wrote when they learned penmanship from rulers and chalkboards. She had told him, with tears in her voice, that the seat was his. Tom wanted it that way. Tom had insisted. But she also warned, hesitantly, that things might get complicated. Protocol, she had called it. Ludacris had smiled gently then and said, "I've been dealing with protocol since '67. Don't worry, I'll get there." And he had meant it. He always found a way to show up. Long before the war and the silence that followed it, Ludacris had built a life measured in small things. At Langston High School in Birmingham, he mopped the floors before the first bell rang and stayed long after the final one echoed down the hallways. He fixed broken lockers with butter knives and duct tape, unclogged toilets without flinching, and once spent an entire Christmas break repainting a mural in the gym after some vandals had defaced it. He never asked for overtime. Never complained. Just did the job because it needed to be done. Teachers came and went. Principals shook his hand. Students called him Mr. L with a mix of affection and mild fear, especially when he caught them skipping class. He watched generations pass through those halls, some of them now doctors, lawyers, even state senators. Most of them never knew his first name. He remembered the sound of his wife humming in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, how she used to fold his work shirts while talking to the television like it could hear her. They had met at a church picnic, where she beat him in a three-legged race and then shared her lemonade out of guilt. They built a quiet life together, nothing fancy, but full of warmth. When she passed, something in him dimmed. He kept the house just as she left it, her slippers by the bed, her cookbook still open to favorite pages, her voice still echoing in the quiet when the kettle boiled. Ludacris never had children. Not by choice, just by fate. His wife had been unable, and they accepted it. Instead, they adopted half the neighborhood, always giving out candy on Halloween, bandaging scraped knees, and slipping gas money into envelopes for young folks trying to get to college. It was never about being noticed. It was about doing right. He thought about all that as he walked past the stone walls and ceremonial guards, watching how the breeze stirred the flags just so, like a whisper from someone watching. In this place, you could almost hear the lives behind the uniforms. The ones who came home in pieces, and the ones who never came home at all. He had buried too many friends in places like this, and this one hurt the deepest. Thomas Becket had been more than a war buddy. He was a brother by bond, by blood spilled together, by secrets carried alone. In Vietnam, they shared everything, food, shelter, prayers, and fear. It was Becket who pulled Ludacris from a booby-trapped foxhole, Beckett who stood between him and a drunken superior during a bad night in camp, and Beckett who wrote to Ludacris's wife when Ludacris was too tired or too scared to do it himself. Ludacris returned the debt in quantum, carrying Beckett's bleeding body on his back through enemy fire. Neither of them ever talked about it much after. It wasn't pride. It was just too sacred for casual words. After the war, they drifted, Beckett went up the military ladder, and Ludacris returned to mops and lockers. Yet every few years, Beckett would show up at Ludacris's porch with a six-pack and a story, sometimes with a commendation he'd been awarded, sometimes just with silence and a long stare at the Alabama sky. It wasn't until years later that Ludacris realized what those visits really meant. They were his way of saying thank you, of keeping the bond alive in the only way he knew how. As Ludacris neared the main gate of the cemetery, he felt the eyes of younger soldiers passing by, their crisp uniforms and polished shoes a mirror to the boy he used to be. None of them looked twice. Just another old man. Just another wrinkle in the crowd. He didn't blame them. Time had a way of softening edges and blurring heroes into shadows. He stopped beside a row of hedges, taking out a handkerchief to dab the sweat from his brow. The sun was climbing now, and the weight of the journey was settling in his knees. But his hands were steady as he reached again for the envelope. He looked at it, ran his fingers over the ink, and let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had come this far, and no matter what happened next, whether they let him in or turned him away again, he knew he had fulfilled his promise. He had shown up. Because that's what brothers do. That's what legacy looks like when it's quiet, humble, and unforgettable. It isn't carved in marble or pinned to uniforms. It lives in people who remember, who carry the weight when no one's looking, and who show up even when no one's expecting them. And Ludacris Delroy had always shown up. Ludacris stood just a few paces from the main entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, watching the flow of polished shoes, dark suits, and gleaming metals pass through the gates with practiced ease. Everyone had somewhere to be, some list they were on, some name that gave them permission. He adjusted the brim of his brown felt hat, then slid his hand into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out the envelope. It was slightly wrinkled now from the ride and the walk, but the ink remained strong. Rebecca Beckett's handwriting curled across the front like something written from the heart. Mr. Ludacris, please escort to front. Sincerely, Rebecca Beckett. He held it carefully, not like a pass, but like a keepsake. Because to him, it wasn't just permission. It was memory. It was acknowledgement. It was all the things that hadn't been said since the war ended and life went back to pretending things were normal. With a breath to steady his steps, Ludacris approached the security checkpoint. Two officers stood at attention, their uniforms sharp, their expressions neutral. One was young, barely shaving by the look of his chin, and the other tall and lean with the kind of stiffness that said he followed orders down to the letter. Ludacris offered a respectful nod and extended the envelope. "Morning, sirs. I'm here for General Beckett's service. His wife said to show you this." The shorter officer took the envelope, squinted at the cursive like it was written in another language, then looked back at Ludacris with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sir, do you have your name on the official guest list?" Ludacris shook his head. "No, son. Just this letter. I served with the general." Rebecca said this would be enough. The taller officer leaned in to read over his partner's shoulder. His eyes flicked back and forth between the paper and the man holding it. "We need to verify names through the master list. Orders from the family liaison." Ludacris held their gaze, calm but unflinching. His voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. "I came a long way. I just want to pay my respects. That man meant the world to me." The younger guard shifted awkwardly, sympathy flickering for a moment. "I hear you, sir, I really do. But this is a high-level event. We've got strict protocol. Without clearance, we can't let you in. It's not personal." Of course it wasn't personal. Ludacris had lived his whole life knowing how things could be dismissed with that phrase. It wasn't personal when his job applications were passed over. It wasn't personal when he worked 30 years without a raise. It wasn't personal when his wife was denied a hospital bed because their insurance lapsed a week too soon. And now it wasn't personal when he was being turned away from the funeral of the man he had once carried bleeding through enemy fire. He nodded slowly, tipping his hat out of habit. "Understood," he said. He stepped back from the gate, eyes drifting to the rows of white chairs under the green canopy where the casket now rested, draped in the flag they had both fought beneath. The guests were moving with purpose, finding their seats, whispering greetings. A bugler was tuning up. Ludacris took off his hat, pressed it to his chest, and tried one more time. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice barely above the wind. "That man back there, I pulled him out of a rice field with a hole in his chest. I ain't trying to steal nobody's seat." The guards didn't move. "I'm sorry, sir," the tall one repeated. "We've got our orders." Ludacris stepped aside without protest and leaned against the cool stone wall near the gate. His knees ached from the travel, from the standing, from the weight of a morning that should have been sacred. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a handkerchief his wife had embroidered with his initials. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, faded and frayed at the edges. Two young men in muddy fatigues grinned at the camera, arms slung around each other, eyes too young to know what lay ahead. One was Ludacris. The other was Beckett. They looked like they'd just won a bet or outrun death, which, at that time, was nearly the same thing. He stared at the photo, then folded it back into his pocket and watched the crowd drift past. A woman in black brushed by him, perfume trailing behind her. A small child clutched her hand, shoes gleaming in the sun. They didn't notice him. Why would they? He was an old man with a tired suit and no pass, no badge, no place. Yet he stood there, still waiting, not because he expected anything, but because he knew Beckett would have waited for him. A young soldier walked by carrying a clipboard. Ludacris called out softly, "Son." The soldier paused and turned. "Yes, sir." Ludacris lifted the envelope again. "I'm trying to get in. Served with the general. His wife gave me this." The soldier read the front, then nodded politely. "Let me check with the coordinator." He disappeared through the gate. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. No one returned. Ludacris shifted his weight, his back stiffening. Still, he didn't complain. He just waited. Waited the way he always had when others were late, when others forgot, when others overlooked. He kept his feet planted, his hands calm, and his heart steady. Because showing up wasn't about getting in. It was about being there. Even if the world couldn't see him, even if the gate didn't open, he had made it. He had the letter in his pocket, the promise in his chest, and the memory of a brother too sacred to be erased by protocol. Ludacris looked toward the canopy again. The service hadn't started yet, but it would soon. The seats were nearly full. He could hear the chaplain preparing. And still, he waited. Because some things, like respect, like love, like sacrifice, don't need permission to exist. They just are. And in that moment, as the wind stirred the edges of the flag draped over the casket, Ludacris knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving. Not without saying goodbye. Ludacris stood to the side of the south gate, eyes tracing every face that passed by. His back rested lightly against the stone wall, the sun pressing down harder now, seeping into the fabric of his blazer. He didn't shift much. Every movement was measured, each muscle conserving strength. But his eyes, they were sharp, deliberate, scanning the crowd with the quiet persistence of a man who had spent his life being overlooked. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had a lanyard or a pin or a ribbon on their lapel. No one looked twice at the black man in the brown blazer holding a folded letter and a memory too large to carry alone. One couple passed him, a tall man in a gray suit and a woman in a dark green dress. The man glanced at Ludacris, his eyes flickering with curiosity or discomfort, it was hard to tell. But he said nothing. They kept walking. A few more came, guests moving swiftly toward the growing sound of brass instruments warming up and the low hum of military ceremony beginning to take shape. Ludacris watched them all, not with bitterness but with a kind of detached understanding. He'd lived long enough to recognize the look people gave when they didn't know what to do with someone like him. Someone outside the plan, outside the list, outside the clean boundaries of official mourning. He wiped his brow again, this time a little slower. The air had shifted, hotter now, like the morning was tipping toward noon. The weight was getting harder. His knees barked with every shift in weight, and his hips sent a dull ache up his side that he'd long ago learned to ignore. He took another breath, slow and deep, and glanced back at the envelope in his pocket. It was still there. Rebecca's writing. The invitation that meant more than any badge. She had known. She had remembered. That was enough, for now. A woman in all black passed close by, heels clicking against the pavement. Her perfume was strong, elegant. Behind her, a small boy bounced along in shiny shoes, one hand gripping his mother's fingers. Ludacris smiled faintly. The boy reminded him of one of his former students, Jamal, always moving, always asking questions. Jamal had gone on to join the Navy. Sent a postcard once from Guam. Called him coach, even though Ludacris had never coached a day in his life. Just offered the boy a peanut butter sandwich and a few words after school one day when he'd gotten suspended for fighting. The ache in his knees deepened, and Ludacris shifted his weight again, this time leaning harder into the wall. Still, he said nothing. He had waited longer for less. That was how things often worked for men like him. He remembered a time back in '72 when he showed up to a ceremony honoring veterans from his town. Beckett had been there, giving a speech. The mayor had even mentioned Ludacris's name, then skipped over it like an accidental footnote. Afterward, Beckett had come over, furious on his behalf, but Ludacris had just shaken his head. "Ain't about that," he said. "I know who I am." But today felt different. This wasn't just another oversight. This was his last chance to stand beside his brother. To be seen not as an extra in someone else's story, but as part of the reason that story ever happened at all. A young soldier passed by holding a clipboard, his uniform crisp, his eyes darting from name tag to name tag. Ludacris reached out a hand, not blocking the way, just catching attention. "Son," he said gently. The soldier turned. "Yes, sir." Ludacris handed him the envelope. "Rebecca Beckett wrote this. Said I could sit up front." The soldier read it, nodded once, then offered a polite half-smile. "Let me check with the coordinator." He walked through the gates and vanished into the rows of chairs and military formality. Ludacris stood straighter for a moment, hope rising in his chest like a breath held too long. But the minutes ticked by, slow and quiet. The soldier didn't return. 1 minute stretched into 5, then 10. People continued to stream past. Nobody noticed the man still waiting just outside the ceremony's reach. No one thought to ask why he stood alone. Somewhere behind the canopy, a chaplain's voice began to rise. It was starting. The ceremony. The moment. Ludacris turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the flag-draped casket now resting beneath the green canvas. The image hit him like a blow, final, unchanging. Beckett was there. And Ludacris was not. He let out a slow exhale, not anger, not even frustration. Just the kind of sigh a man makes when he's known how a thing would go before it even started. He looked back to the guards at the gate. They were now checking IDs of a new group. The tall one met his eye briefly, then looked away. Ludacris didn't move. He didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. What would be the point? The people moving into the funeral didn't see him. Not truly. They saw what they expected to see, an old man, likely lost, maybe confused. No rank. No pass. No relevance. But he had been there. In the mud. In the blood. In the smoke where Beckett almost died and Ludacris had refused to let him. He had been there in the silence that followed, the years of visits on porches and the bonds that didn't need medals to be real. And he was here now. Still here. Because love doesn't stop at the gate. Because memory doesn't ask for credentials. A breeze lifted, catching the edge of his blazer. The fabric rippled slightly, like it too wanted to be let in. Ludacris looked down at his shoes, still polished, still shining in the light. He straightened his collar again, more out of ritual than necessity, and turned his gaze back toward the canopy, where people were now seated, heads bowed. He didn't belong on any list. He never had. But he belonged to the story. And in that quiet defiance, standing alone in the sun, Ludacris decided he would wait a little longer. Maybe someone would see him. Maybe not. But he wouldn't move. Because no matter what the guard said, or what the names on the list said, he knew the truth. He had earned his place. And he wasn't leaving. The sounds of Arlington faded, replaced by a jungle's chorus, thick, wet, and alive. In his mind, Ludacris was no longer standing outside the south gate under the relentless Virginia sun. He was 25 again, crouched low behind a rotting tree stump with a rifle clutched tight against his chest. The leaves above shimmered with heat, and the air was dense with gunpowder and fear. Quantum, June 1968. A recon mission gone sideways. The radio was dead, the lieutenant was bleeding, and the tree line ahead spat bullets with terrifying rhythm. Time had slowed then, warped by adrenaline and chaos, and even now, more than 50 years later, it returned with an awful clarity. He remembered how sweat had dripped into his eyes but he hadn't blinked. How every breath had been loud in his ears, competing with the scattered shouting of men and the mechanical stammer of machine gun fire. Somewhere to his left, Thomas Beckett had shouted. Ludacris could still hear his voice now as if it had never left. "You got eyes on the ridge?" Beckett had asked, crouched beside him, his shoulder leaking blood, his helmet gone. There was dirt smeared across his jaw and the steely calm of a man who knew they were boxed in. Ludacris had replied with something short and grim, pulling a smoke grenade from Beckett's vest when his own were gone. It was instinct, not orders. He'd yanked the pin and tossed the canister toward the heaviest fire. A second later, a burst of purple smoke bloomed across the jungle floor, and Ludacris didn't hesitate. He grabbed Beckett under the arms and hauled him up, slinging him over one shoulder like he weighed nothing. His legs screamed, his back burned, and his lungs threatened to collapse, but he ran low and fast through the underbrush. Branches tore at his arms, mud sucked at his boots, and bullets snapped past his ears. Still, he ran. He didn't stop until he reached a shallow trench half covered in brush. He threw Beckett down and landed beside him, both of them panting, alive by inches. Even now, Ludacris could feel the tremble in his arms from that day, the sting of the cuts, the smell of gun oil, and blood and earth mixed into something primal. They had stayed in that trench for hours, barely breathing, until the rest of the platoon circled back. No one else saw what happened. No one wrote it down. No medal followed. No citation. Just a quiet ride back to camp and Beckett pressing a folded piece of cloth into Ludacris's hand a day later. "I stitched that with fishing line," he'd said. "It's just a scrap, but if I don't make it, you wear that, you hear me? That way, a part of me still makes it home." Ludacris had worn it, not out in the open, but always close. A faded green strip of fabric with 2 letters stitched in tight, TB. He never showed it to anyone. Never needed to. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering. It was about carrying a piece of the man who never stopped calling him brother, even when others couldn't see past skin or status or uniform stripes. Back in Alabama, after the war, they never talked much about what happened. Not because they didn't want to, but because there were too many layers of silence to cut through. Beckett had gone on to officer school, rising through the ranks quickly. His name appeared in newspapers, on plaques, and eventually on invitations to rooms Ludacris never stepped inside. Still, every now and then, a black SUV would roll up outside Ludacris's modest house, and Beckett would step out with a bottle and a grin. They'd sit on the porch, just the two of them, passing the time like they used to before the jungle changed everything. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But the silence between them was never empty. It held everything the world had forgotten. There was one time, Ludacris recalled, when Beckett had tried to do something official. He'd written a letter, something formal, recommending Ludacris for a medal long after the war. But the request never went anywhere. Ludacris had smiled when Beckett told him. "You don't have to do that," he said. Beckett looked at him hard and replied, "I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because you deserve to be remembered." But Ludacris didn't want a medal. He had his memories. He had the photo of them in the jungle, arms over shoulders, grinning like fools. He had the armband. He had the porch visits. That was enough. Until today. Today, standing outside Beckett's funeral, Ludacris realized that maybe it wasn't enough anymore. Not because he wanted applause, but because he needed to say goodbye properly. He needed someone, anyone, to know what it meant to carry a man through hell and still call him brother when the world wasn't watching. He looked down at his hands, now veined and stiff, and thought of how they once held a rifle, how they had pressed into the ground to steady a wounded friend, how they had carried him out of death's grip. He remembered Beckett's breath on his neck, ragged and short, as he whispered, "Don't let go." And he hadn't. Not then. Not now. A soft breeze lifted a few leaves near the curb. Somewhere deeper in the cemetery, a bugle played its first mournful notes. Ludacris swallowed hard. His eyes returned to the gate. The two officers were still there, still scanning passes, still looking through people like they were names on a spreadsheet. Ludacris wasn't angry at them. They were just following orders. But the war had taught him that orders weren't everything. Sometimes you had to act on what was right. Not what was approved. He brushed the dust from his sleeve and adjusted the creases in his trousers. If no one came to bring him in, then so be it. He had already crossed bigger lines than this in his life. The line between fear and courage. Between life and death. Between being forgotten and choosing to remember. He would wait. As long as it took. Because in quantum, he hadn't left Beckett behind. And he wouldn't start now. The sun had begun its slow crawl upward, casting longer shadows across the stone paths of Arlington. Ludacris shifted slightly, enough to ease the sharpest pull in his lower back, but not enough to leave the spot he had claimed beside the south gate. The chapel music had softened now, replaced by the low murmur of people taking their seats, of programs being unfolded, of uniforms rustling like leaves on a windless day. Ludacris didn't look away. His eyes were fixed on the canopy where the flag-draped casket rested in dignified stillness. He could feel the service drawing near, the finality pressing closer with each passing second, like a weight slowly lowering onto his shoulders. His hand reached instinctively for the inside of his blazer. His fingers brushed the letter again, still there, still unread by the men who mattered at the gate. But what tugged at him more now wasn't the paper. It was a memory, unexpected and sharp, of the day Beckett's promotion had made the evening news. Ludacris had sat on his porch that night, a lukewarm beer in hand, watching a young TV anchor mispronounce Beckett's name twice before correcting herself and calling him a symbol of bravery and command. The picture they showed was clean-cut, suited, all medals and authority. It was a good picture. A proud one. But what stung wasn't seeing Beckett in that frame. It was knowing who wasn't in it. Not once had Ludacris been mentioned. Not in any of the bios, the press briefings, or the ceremonial coverage. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even angry. He just felt hollow in a way he couldn't explain. Not because he had wanted recognition, but because their story had always been told as one man's rise instead of two men's survival. One name made it into history. The other was left in the mud, where no cameras went. He had never talked about it. Not to his wife, not to his neighbors, not even to Beckett. There had been a moment years ago when Beckett had visited, sitting across from him on that creaky porch swing, the air thick with cicadas and the scent of fried okra still lingering from dinner. Beckett had looked at him with that familiar quiet guilt, the kind that showed up when a man knows he's living the life someone else helped him keep. "You know," he said softly, "there's not a speech I give where I don't think about you." Ludacris had nodded once and replied, "That's good enough." And at the time, it was. It had to be. But now, standing on the edge of a ceremony he wasn't allowed to enter, Ludacris felt the sting of that silence heavier than ever. The final chapter of Beckett's life was being written, and once again, his own name had been left off the page. It wasn't just a formality anymore. It was erasure. He could feel it in the way people passed him by without a second glance, in the way the guards had smiled politely while turning him away, in the way no one returned with news about the envelope or the coordinator. It was a soft kind of dismissal, the kind that didn't shout but whispered, "You don't belong." He looked down at his shoes again, the polish dulling under the dust of the walkway. Those shoes had walked thousands of miles across waxed floors and broken sidewalks. They had walked beside caskets and under banners. They had walked in marches where no cameras came and stood in doorways when no one wanted to answer. But today, they stood still. Today, they waited. A small group passed behind him, chatting softly in somber tones. One woman mentioned the general's record, 5 deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Distinguished Service Cross. Another man added how much Beckett had done for military reform, how his leadership had inspired a generation. Ludacris listened without comment. All of it was true. Beckett had earned his legacy. But legacies, Ludacris knew, didn't just come from battlefield decisions or public speeches. Sometimes they came from the unspoken moments, the split-second choices in the mud, the nights spent holding a rifle beside someone else's wound, the decades of quiet support given without expectation of return. That was his legacy. The part that never made it into footnotes. The part no one would read from a podium. Still, Ludacris wasn't bitter. He had never been the kind of man who lived for applause. But grief had a strange way of scraping old wounds, and this particular wound, the wound of being forgotten, had never fully closed. It wasn't just about him. It was about truth. It was about making sure that someone, anyone, knew he had been there. That he had mattered. That Beckett hadn't walked this life alone. He took out the armband again, unfolded it carefully, the faded green cloth soft from years of being kept close. The 2 letters, TB, were still legible, stitched with fishing line during a recovery week in Vietnam. Beckett had made it after Ludacris had saved his life and insisted he wear it like a badge. "So if I don't make it," he'd said, "a part of me still does." Ludacris had worn it under his uniform the rest of that tour, tucked inside his sock, where no officer would see. He had worn it during the flight home. Worn it at his wife's funeral. Worn it today. He didn't cry. Not because he didn't want to, but because the tears felt like they belonged to another moment. Right now, all he felt was a kind of solid resolve, the kind built from years of being last to speak, last to be acknowledged, but first to act when it mattered. He folded the armband and slipped it back into his pocket. His hands trembled only slightly. The sounds from the ceremony rose. A voice at the podium, a quiet hymn, the shuffle of paper. Ludacris closed his eyes. He could almost hear Beckett's voice rising above the noise, calling out over the gunfire, his words sure even when his body was broken. And he remembered his own answer, yelled through the trees, "I got you, man. I got you. He had never let go. Not then. Not now. Not today. Ludacris stood with his hands folded in front of him, his thumb gently pressing against the edge of the letter tucked inside his blazer. The service had begun. The murmurs had quieted. Somewhere beyond the crowd and the canopy, the chaplain's voice drifted across the manicured lawn like the low hum of memory itself. A hymn whispered through the air, the kind that clung to your bones and reminded you of everything you'd ever loved and lost. Yet Ludacris remained still, rooted in the small pocket of shadow near the stone wall by the gate, invisible to the movement around him. No one had returned for him. No clipboard-holding soldier. No family liaison. Not even a second glance from the guards. And yet, something in him refused to turn around. The years had taught him patience, but more than that, they had taught him resolve. He adjusted his stance, easing the weight off his right hip, and watched the gate as if willing it to open with nothing but his gaze. He had no more speeches to give, no more arguments to make. The envelope, the photo, the armband, all of it had been offered and met with silence. So now he waited, not because he believed someone would come, but because that's what you did when someone you loved was on the other side. You waited. No matter how long it took. No matter how long you'd already waited. He was just reaching into his pocket again to touch the armband when he sensed movement, something subtle but distinct, a shift in the rhythm of the space around him. Across the lawn, past the rows of white chairs and polished uniforms, a tall figure had begun walking deliberately down the central path. The man was in full dress uniform, his shoulders broad, posture perfect, the silver trim of his epaulets glinting in the sunlight. The ribbons across his chest shimmered with color and weight, and on each of his shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars. Not hurried, but with purpose, the man's strides were steady and direct. He wasn't following the curve of the crowd or the rhythm of the ceremony. He was coming toward the gate. And more than that, he was coming toward Ludacris. The 2 guards at the checkpoint straightened instinctively as the figure approached, their rigid discipline temporarily disrupted by the gravity of his presence. One of them stepped forward, stammering something about clearance and protocol, but the tall man raised a single hand. Not to silence them with authority, but with finality. It was not a command. It was a decision already made. As the tall man reached the edge of the ceremony space, he paused for a breath, then turned fully toward Ludacris. For a moment, time felt suspended. Even the flag seemed to hang a little lower in the air. The general's eyes scanned Ludacris from head to toe. Not with suspicion, but with recognition. He nodded once, then crossed the final few steps until they stood face to face on either side of the gate. Up close, Ludacris could see the fine lines at the corners of the man's eyes, the weight of command etched into every angle of his face. Yet those eyes were not cold. They were watchful. Human. The general spoke first, his voice low and respectful. "Sir," he said, "may I ask your name?" Ludacris held his gaze and answered quietly. "Ludacris. Ludacris Delroy." The general nodded slowly, as if placing a missing piece into a puzzle. "Did you know General Beckett?" Ludacris inhaled, letting the name settle between them. "Since I was 9, he said. "I served with him. Quantum, 1968. The general didn't respond right away. Instead, he did something unexpected. He straightened, then raised his right hand to his brow and delivered a full, formal military salute. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't a token. It was the kind of salute given only to equals. To men who had earned it. Ludacris blinked, his chest tightening, and for a brief second, he felt like the decades had folded in on themselves, collapsing into this single instant where someone finally saw him not as a bystander, but as a part of the story. The general lowered his hand and spoke again. "Mr. Delroy, would you allow me the honor of escorting you to your seat?" Ludacris opened his mouth to reply, but the words tangled in his throat. For a man who had spent a lifetime speaking when no one listened, now, when the moment finally came, silence held him captive. He nodded. The general turned to the two guards who had earlier turned Ludicrous away. "He goes with me," he said simply. Then he stepped aside, offering Ludicrous the path forward. And Ludicrous, after a long moment, stepped through the gate. As they began walking together down the central path, the sea of heads turned, one by one. The ceremony had not stopped entirely, but it had shifted, a quiet hush rippling through the crowd like the wind before a storm. People whispered, curious, confused. Some recognized Ludicrous's face from old photographs, others did not. But everyone felt the weight of what they were witnessing. It was not the walk of a guest. It was the return of a brother. The general walked a half-step behind him, hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of reverence. Ludicrous moved slowly, carefully, each step deliberate as if the ground itself were sacred. And in a way, it was. He looked ahead to the green canopy, to the casket beneath the flag, and to the single empty chair next to Rebecca Beckett. He was no longer standing at the edge. No longer waiting for permission. He was home. As Ludicrous stepped beyond the gate and onto the path, his shoes met the polished stone with a muffled tap that rang louder in his ears than the distant hymn drifting from the canopy. The general beside him walked with a reverence that made the world seem to move more slowly. Behind them, the guards had straightened to attention, no longer scanning names or issuing orders. Their job, for a moment, had become irrelevant. Something larger than regulation had just unfolded in front of them, and the air between the white marble and dark suits began to feel charged with a quiet recognition that nobody had expected but everyone could feel. The crowd began to stir as Ludicrous and the general advanced up the central aisle. Conversations dropped into murmurs and then into silence. People turned in their seats, some rising slightly, others craning their necks to get a better look. The whisper of uniforms shifting and shoes adjusting echoed louder than any speech could. It wasn't the entrance of someone famous or powerful. It was the return of something sacred, something that had been missing and was now being restored. Ludicrous kept his eyes forward, fixed on the flag-draped casket at the front of the assembly. Every step closer made his breath shallow, his chest tighter. The reality of where he was, what this was, began to settle into the core of him like gravity. He felt the weight of years carried in silence, of memories never spoken aloud, of loyalty unrecorded. And now, here he was, walking down the aisle at the funeral of the man he had carried through war and life, no longer standing outside but being led in as he should have been all along. Rebecca Beckett turned as she heard the steps approaching. When her eyes landed on Ludicrous, something in her face softened. Her hand went to her heart, and her chin trembled, but she did not cry. She simply stood up, stepped aside, and nodded gently, as if to say, "It's about time." Ludicrous removed his hat as he reached the front row. The general paused behind him, giving him space. Ludicrous looked at the empty chair beside Rebecca, the one she had written about in her letter, the one he had almost never reached. He lowered himself into the seat with care, every joint reminding him of the years that had passed since the day he and Beckett had stood side by side in a jungle far away. The fabric of the chair was warm from the sun. He adjusted his blazer and sat up straight, not for appearance but for respect. His eyes flicked to the casket. The flag seemed to glow in the filtered light, red and white and blue catching the breeze like a final salute. And beneath that cloth was a man who had once laughed beside him while hiding in mud, who had thrown his own body in front of a grenade that thankfully never exploded, who had never once stopped calling Ludicrous his brother, even when the world tried to define them differently. The chaplain paused mid-sentence when he noticed the new figure seated at the front. He looked to the general, who gave a nod that said everything that needed saying. Without missing a beat, the chaplain resumed, but his voice had changed. It carried a note of awe now, a humility threaded between the words about honor and sacrifice. Ludicrous listened, but only partly. His mind wandered to other ceremonies he had never been part of, to medals Beckett had worn that bore no trace of their shared nights in the field, to news articles that described heroism without ever mentioning who kept the hero alive. Today, Something was being rewritten, not with ink or speeches but with presence. Just being here, sitting in this chair, Ludacris was reclaiming a place history had almost denied him. Rebecca leaned toward him, her voice low but unwavering. "He waited for you," she said. "Every year, he hoped you'd come to one of these ceremonies. He never said it out loud, but I could tell. Every time he stood on a stage, he scanned the crowd. Looking for you." Ludacris didn't answer right away. He stared at the casket. Then, softly, he replied, "I was never far." The general quietly took a seat 2 rows behind, allowing the family their moment. Around them, the congregation had settled into reverent stillness. Some still stared at Ludacris, but not with the indifference from before. Now it was curiosity mixed with something else, shame, perhaps, or admiration, or both. It was a strange feeling, being seen after decades of living at the edge of things. But Ludacris didn't need their approval. He just needed this moment to last long enough for the weight in his chest to ease. A Marine stepped forward, crisp and solemn, and began folding the flag into a perfect triangle. Each motion was precise, each crease exact. Ludacris watched the hands move, the flag slowly becoming smaller, tighter, until it was a symbol you could carry with one hand but feel with your entire body. When the Marine turned to present the flag, he didn't offer it to Rebecca. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes on Ludacris. With both hands, she took the flag and gently placed it into Ludacris's lap. "He wanted you to have this," she said. Ludacris tried to protest, but she shook her head, firm and final. No one else pulled him out of that trench. No one else held his hand in the hospital. No one else deserves it more. He held the folded flag to his chest, both hands trembling slightly. It felt heavier than it looked, like it carried every unspoken word and every silent moment they had shared. He pressed it close, not out of pride but out of reverence. It was more than cloth. It was a life. It was theirs. The chaplain continued, his voice rising again, but Ludacris heard only the sound of a man's laughter in the dark, the echo of boots on wet ground, the voice that once said, "Don't let go." He hadn't. And now, finally, he had brought him home. Ludacris sat with the folded flag pressed tightly against his chest, his fingers running gently along the crisp edges, feeling the careful creases as if they held every breath Beckett had taken in his final days. Around him, the weight of the ceremony settled like a solemn fog, and yet there was peace in it. Not the peace of closure, because that had never really been what he came for, but the peace of being present. For the first time since he arrived, he no longer felt like a ghost standing outside his own history. He was part of this moment. Seen. Included. Not by invitation, not by list, but by truth. By bond. He glanced at Rebecca seated beside him. Her face was calm but pale, her hands folded in her lap like she was holding in the last fragile pieces of her composure. He wanted to say something comforting, something easy like, "He loved you," or, "He spoke of you often," but the words stuck. They felt too small. So instead, he reached into his coat pocket slowly, carefully, until his fingers wrapped around the soft, worn fabric he always kept close. He pulled out the armband, that strip of faded green cloth with 2 letters stitched in tight with fishing line, TB. It was rough now, the edges frayed, the stitching uneven from decades of being folded, hidden, kept close during moments that mattered. Rebecca looked down at it, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "What's that?" she asked softly. Ludacris turned it over in his hand. "He made it for me," he said. After Quantum. Said if he didn't make it out, I should wear this so a part of him would still be there. She reached out and touched it, her fingers barely grazing the fabric as though it might disappear if handled too firmly. "He never told me," she whispered. Ludacris nodded. He wouldn't. Wasn't something he'd want public. It was just between us. The armband had been his anchor through so many years. He'd carried it through his wife's funeral, through the retirement party where no one remembered his name, through nights when the pain in his knees kept him from sleep, through mornings when he woke up and wondered if anyone even remembered the war anymore. But he remembered. Every thread of it. And every thread of this cloth. He thought back to the day Beckett had handed it to him. They had been back at base, Beckett's shoulder still in a sling, his expression somewhere between anger and relief. "You could have left me," he said. "Hell, maybe you should have." Ludacris had just looked at him and said, "I couldn't. Wasn't raised that way." That night, Beckett had taken an old undershirt, cut a strip from the hem, and stitched those initials in silence while Ludacris sat nearby, drinking instant coffee and listening to the static of a broken radio. When he'd handed it over, he hadn't said much. "Just, in case I don't come back next time." Ludacris never asked why Beckett trusted him so deeply. He never needed to. Some answers are written in mud and blood and the silent moments between gunfire. Now, holding it at his friend's funeral, Ludacris felt the ache of that memory swell and press against his chest like a rising tide. He considered placing the armband inside the casket, letting it rest with Beckett at last. But something in him resisted. It wasn't sentimentality. It wasn't attachment. It was the promise. The meaning. The reason it had been given. Not as a goodbye, but as a way to carry forward. To remember. To endure. He folded the armband again, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. He placed it back into his pocket, near the letter and the photo, and returned his gaze to the casket. The ceremony was moving into its final portion now. A Marine officer stepped forward with slow, precise steps, holding a ceremonial rifle. In the distance, the rifle team raised their weapons. The first shot rang out like a crack of thunder. Ludacris flinched, not visibly, but deep inside where the years still lived raw. The second shot followed, and then the third, each one carving its mark into the stillness. The sound echoed across the hills, a tribute of finality that vibrated through stone and bone. The bugler lifted his instrument, and the first notes of taps broke through the silence. It was a melody that had followed Ludacris across decades, each note soft and terrible, beautiful and hollow. As it played, he closed his eyes. He could see the faces of the boys who hadn't come home. He could see Beckett crouched in that trench, bloodied but alive. He could see himself, younger, stronger, running through the jungle with a man's life on his back and his own heart beating so loudly it almost drowned out the war. When the final note faded into the wind, the chaplain stepped forward again and offered words about honor, about sacrifice, about duty fulfilled. But Ludacris didn't hear them. Not really. His mind was elsewhere. On porches and fishing trips, on laughter that came too rarely and silence that said more than words ever could. On two boys who grew up in Alabama and survived a war together only to be separated by titles and time. Rebecca turned to him again and took his hand. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for today. For all of it. For him." Ludacris looked at her, eyes clouded with the weight of everything he couldn't say. "We kept each other alive," he murmured. "One way or another." And that was the truth. He had saved Beckett's life in Vietnam, yes, but Beckett had saved him in other ways. In the visits. In the memories. In the simple act of showing up, even when no one else did. Their friendship hadn't been loud. It hadn't been something the world celebrated. But it had endured. Through war. Through silence. Through absence. And now, through death. Ludacris sat a little taller, the flag still pressed against his chest, the armband resting against his heart. The years had not defeated him. The gate had not stopped him. And protocol had not erased him. He had shown up. And he would carry this moment forward for the both of them. As the flag ceremony concluded and the last solemn notes of the bugle faded into the wind, the crowd at Arlington began to settle once more into stillness. Ludacris remained seated, the flag clutched tightly in his hands, Rebecca's quiet presence beside him grounding him in a moment that felt suspended in time. But even with the most sacred rites fulfilled, there was still a hum of something unresolved in the air, something just out of reach. The kind of thing you feel before it happens, when the world is about to shift ever so slightly in your direction. From where he sat, Ludacris could see rows of black suits, polished shoes, starched military uniforms, and solemn faces. He saw medals shining on chests, some of which he recognized, others he didn't. The front rows were occupied by men and women whose lives had orbited around Beckett's legacy, advisors, colleagues, dignitaries, but few of them had ever seen him in the places Ludacris had. None of them had pulled him through ankle-deep mud with bullets cracking overhead. None had huddled beside him under monsoon-soaked tarps, praying the night would end before the gunfire began again. These people had known the general. Ludacris had known the man. He shifted slightly in his chair, his back stiff, his legs sore from hours of standing and waiting. The emotion hadn't passed, it had only settled deeper. He looked down at the flag once more, then back toward the assembled guests. Many had their heads bowed. A few looked toward him now and again, unsure what to make of his presence. A few whispers had stirred as he walked in with the general. Some of them were probably wondering who he was, why the man with 4 stars had halted the ceremony to bring an elderly stranger inside. But Ludacris had no interest in explaining himself. The story wasn't for them. Still, across the rows, one man had not stopped watching. Not since Ludacris sat down. He was seated further back, younger than most, with short cropped hair and a clean, undecorated uniform that suggested he was early in his service. He looked out of place among the admirals and senators, like he had gotten a seat by mistake. But his eyes stayed on Ludacris with a kind of focus that didn't feel like judgment. It felt like recognition. Ludacris noticed him only because he didn't look away. Not when the chaplain spoke again. Not when the rifle team stood down. Not when the final prayer was offered. And when the crowd began to stir once more, shifting in preparation to leave, the young man stood. He moved through the rows with quiet purpose, head slightly bowed, hands at his sides. As he neared the front, some guests turned, expecting a staff member or a family liaison, but no one stopped him. He stepped up to the aisle beside Ludacris and hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "may I ask something?" Ludacris looked up, his eyes meeting the soldiers. "Go ahead, son. I saw you earlier. At the gate. I didn't understand what was happening. But then the general," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "The way he walked you in. I've never seen anything like it." Ludacris nodded slowly. "Neither had I." "Did you serve with General Beckett?" the young man asked, and when Ludacris didn't answer immediately, he continued. "I mean, I figured. From the way everyone reacted. And the flag, when she gave it to you. That meant something." Ludacris studied the soldier for a long moment, not to evaluate him but to decide how much to offer. Then he said, "I didn't just serve with him. We grew up together. Fought together. Laughed, prayed, bled together. In ways no one else really understands." The young man's posture straightened. "Sir, I hope one day I have a bond like that." "It wasn't just a bond," Ludacris said. "It was a promise. One we made before we knew what it meant." The soldier looked at the armband still visible from Ludacris's coat pocket. "That's his?" "It was," Ludacris answered. "He gave it to me in Vietnam. Said if he didn't make it, at least a part of him would come home." The young man nodded, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper. "I don't mean to be out of line, sir, but I'm glad I saw it. Glad I saw you. Sometimes, in uniform, they teach us about honor and service, but they don't always show us what it looks like when no one's watching." Ludacris looked out toward the horizon. "That's because the most important parts usually happen in the quiet. In the mud. In the waiting. Not everyone gets written into the history books. Doesn't mean they weren't there. The young soldier remained quiet for a moment. Then he did something Ludacris didn't expect. He straightened fully, heels together, chest out, and raised his right hand in a salute. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't show. It was personal. It was one man honoring another without fanfare, without audience, without permission. Ludacris blinked once, and a warmth rose in his chest that he hadn't felt since the last time Beckett knocked on his porch and said nothing for 10 minutes before speaking. He nodded, eyes steady, and returned the salute not with his hand, but with a simple tip of his hat. "You take care of yourself, soldier," he said. "Yes, sir," the young man replied. "And thank you for showing up." As the soldier turned to leave, Ludacris leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle. Someone had seen him. One man had noticed. And sometimes, that was all it took to keep a story alive a little longer. A quiet truth passed from one soul to another. The flag rested heavy in his lap. But his heart, for the first time in a long while, felt light. The ceremony had begun to dissolve into quiet conversation and the soft rustle of people rising from their seats. Some gathered near the casket to pay their final respects, others stood in clusters, exchanging subdued words and handshakes. A few made their way back toward the rows of parked black cars lining the drive. But Ludacris remained seated. He was in no rush. The seat beneath him felt more like home than any church pew ever had. The flag in his lap, still pressed close to his chest, radiated warmth not from the sun but from meaning. He looked toward the distant tree line where the sound of the rifles had echoed. The silence that followed was deep, not hollow but full of memory, full of weight. Rebecca had stepped aside now, speaking softly to a woman in uniform who'd likely helped coordinate the event. The woman nodded deferentially and occasionally glanced back toward Ludacris, her face filled with the kind of humility that only arrives when protocol meets truth. There was no checklist for what had just happened. No training manual to explain how a 4-star general had halted a nationally recognized ceremony to escort a man who had no badge, no clearance, no official recognition, just a letter in his pocket and history in his blood. Ludacris turned his eyes toward the path again. He saw the general returning. General Callister, the man who had noticed what no one else had. The man who had stopped everything. His steps were slower now, more contemplative, as if even he was absorbing what had unfolded. When he reached the front row again, he didn't speak right away. He looked at Ludacris, the way one soldier looks at another, across generations and wars, seeing not age but experience, not silence but story. Then, with no fanfare, he straightened to full height and raised his right hand. The salute was crisp, clean, delivered with the full weight of 4 stars and everything they stood for. But more than that, it was delivered with respect. Not for rank, not for reputation, but for something rarer. Truth lived in the shadows, loyalty carried in silence. Ludacris blinked against the sudden sting in his eyes. His throat tightened. He didn't rise, didn't try to return the salute with precision. Instead, he slowly lifted one trembling hand and placed it gently over his heart, the way he had done as a boy during the anthem, before life had taught him how complicated patriotism could become. He held that gesture, letting it speak in place of words he'd never had the space to say. Callister held his salute a second longer, then dropped his hand and stepped forward. The guests nearby watched in stunned silence as the general extended his hand toward Ludacris. "Mr. Delroy," he said, voice quiet but firm, "thank you for your service to this country. And for being the kind of man that made General Beckett the man he became." Ludacris stared at the offered hand. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't for photographs or show. It was one man honoring another, plain and unscripted. He reached out and clasped it. Their hands met in a firm grip, one forged by duty, the other by decades of holding up the world without recognition. It was not the kind of handshake that passed and was forgotten. It was the kind that carved itself into memory. "Sir," Ludacris said, his voice hoarse, "I didn't come to be seen." "I know," Callister replied. "That's why you deserve to be." They held the moment longer than most would. When they finally released hands, Callister gave a slight nod and stepped back. He didn't return to the podium, didn't speak again. He simply turned and joined the silent assembly, allowing the gravity of what had just occurred to settle over the entire ceremony like dust over time-worn stone. Ludacris leaned back slightly and drew a deep breath, his lungs stretching against a chest tight with emotion. He glanced around. No one dared speak now. The crowd remained hushed, reverent, as though something holy had just occurred and they didn't know how to name it. Even the wind seemed to pause, the leaves of the trees frozen in their trembling. And then, as if responding to an unspoken cue, a handful of service members in the front row rose to their feet. One by one. Slowly. Without instruction. An older Marine with deep creases in his face. A Navy officer with silver hair and a jaw tight with conviction. A young airman who looked barely out of boot camp. Each turned to Ludacris and brought their hands to their brows. Salutes, simple, solemn, absolute. Ludacris sat frozen, stunned, caught between pride and humility, grief and grace. His hands clutched the folded flag a little tighter. He'd spent a lifetime not asking for acknowledgement, not expecting anything but the quiet satisfaction of doing what was right. But here it was. Not because he demanded it. But because he had earned it in ways that no medal could define. He looked to the casket once more. The flag draped across it mirrored the one in his arms. Two pieces of cloth holding two parts of the same story. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to whisper a few words that no one else could hear. "You see that, Tom? They finally know." And in the hush that followed, as the guests slowly lowered their hands and took their seats again, Ludacris felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not the ache of old bones. Not the sting of being forgotten. But something deeper. The kind of peace that only comes when your truth has been seen, not by everyone, but by someone who matters. He sat back, closed his eyes, and let it settle. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ludacris rose slowly from his seat, the flag still held against his chest as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this moment. His knees groaned under the effort, and a dull ache climbed up the back of his legs, but he didn't falter. He stood straight, tall in the way only years of silence can shape a man. Around him, the crowd remained respectfully quiet, many still seated, some with hands resting over their hearts, others simply watching. The general remained nearby, his presence not dominating but present, steady like a sentry of something sacred. Ludacris turned to Rebecca, who was wiping the corner of her eye with a folded tissue. She looked up at him with a soft smile, the kind of expression only those who have endured great love and great loss can offer. He gave her a nod. Nothing needed to be said. Their eyes held the conversation. She stepped aside, offering him space. The casket rested just ahead, the flag draped over it seeming to ripple faintly with each breeze, as if Beckett himself breathed beneath it. The weight of everything Ludacris had carried, decades of memory, the burden of being forgotten, the simple, steadfast loyalty of showing up, gathered in his chest like a knot just shy of release. He wanted to speak to his friend one last time. Not at the microphone. Not for the crowd. Just face to face. Brother to brother. He turned to walk toward the casket. His steps were measured, slow, each footfall landing with quiet authority on the neatly trimmed grass. He passed rows of guests who had once looked through him, now turning their heads as he walked by. He didn't look down, didn't look around. He only looked ahead. Toward the one who had always seen him. Toward the man who had once said, "If I don't make it, carry part of me home." General Callister stepped up beside him. He didn't say a word, didn't offer a gesture. He simply fell into stride, a silent escort of respect. Two men from different worlds, different ranks, different lives, now walking side by side not because it was protocol, but because it was right. The silence between them was powerful. It stretched from the steps of Alabama porches to the battlefield in Quantum to the sacred soil of Arlington. Each stride felt like a stitch threading their separate histories into a shared truth. Neither of them rushed. The moment wasn't about arrival, it was about presence. As they reached the casket, Ludacris paused. He stood at the foot of it, the flag in his arms pressed close. He looked at the one draped over Beckett and felt the ache of memory swell. The laughter in the barracks. The shared smokes in the jungle. The porch visits with no need for words. He remembered how Beckett used to sit with his hands behind his head, looking out over the trees and saying, "You think we'll make it out and still be us?" Ludacris had always replied, "If we're lucky." Now here they were. One above ground. One going under. But still, somehow, side by side. The general gave a short nod and stepped back, allowing Ludacris his space. Ludacris stepped forward, now alone with the casket. He reached out a trembling hand and rested it gently against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes. "You always said we'd go out together," he murmured. Arguing about fishing poles, knees too sore to stand up straight, complaining about the heat. His voice wavered. "Guess that ship sailed." He stood there a moment longer, just breathing, the way you do when you don't want to say goodbye, when the silence between you and the other person still feels full, as if they might answer if you wait long enough. He opened his eyes and let his hand drop. Slowly, he turned to face the gathering. The general stepped forward again, joining him. Together, they turned to walk back down the aisle. The crowd rose this time. All of them. Uniformed officers. Civilian dignitaries. Friends. Strangers. Not by command but by instinct. They rose because they knew something had happened here that went beyond military ceremony. Something that couldn't be planned, rehearsed, or written into an agenda. This was what it looked like when truth interrupted tradition. When loyalty outlasted legacy. When a man who had been forgotten was walked to the front of history by someone who recognized his worth. Ludacris walked with the general at his side, flag in arms, shoulders squared. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply walked, because sometimes walking is the loudest way to speak. Each step was a declaration that he had been there. That he had mattered. That friendship wasn't about titles or ranks or what got printed in programs. It was about who came back for you. Who waited. Who remembered. They reached the end of the aisle and paused. The general looked at him again and said nothing. He didn't have to. The salute still lingered between them like a bridge that didn't need rebuilding. Ludacris offered a small nod, then turned back once more toward the casket. One last look. One last breath. The sun shone brighter now, casting shadows behind them instead of ahead. And in that light, Ludacris saw everything clearly. Not the crowd. Not the chapel. Just the man he had once saved and who had, in his own way, saved him right back. They had walked through war together. Now, at last, they walked through peace. Ludacris sat once again beside Rebecca, the weight of the folded flag still firm in his hands, heavier somehow than when it had first been placed there. Not in mass, but in meaning. It rested in his lap like a chapter sealed, yet also like a beginning he hadn't expected to reach. Around him, the guests were slowly settling back into their seats, the final movements of the ceremony unfolding like the slow closing of a great book. Ludacris kept his eyes fixed ahead, not on the people, not on the general now standing respectfully at a distance, but on the flag that had been draped over Beckett's casket and now rested in his grasp. It was more than cloth. More than honor. It was a symbol of every quiet sacrifice never spoken aloud. A symbol of promises kept long after anyone was left to remember them. Rebecca turned slightly toward him, her voice low and unshaken. "He said you were the reason he ever came home," she whispered. "He told me that once. Said if it hadn't been for you, Vietnam would have ended differently." Ludacris didn't respond right away. His thumb moved gently over the folded edge of the flag. He nodded slowly. "We kept each other alive," he said. "Not just back there. Even after." Rebecca's gaze dropped to the flag. "He wanted you to have it," she said. "He made that clear. Even when they asked about protocol. About family. He insisted it was yours." Ludacris felt a lump rise in his throat. "I tried to give it back," he admitted. "Didn't feel right at first. But now." "You don't have to explain," she interrupted gently. "You were his brother in every way that mattered." He looked over at her, his eyes soft but steady. "I didn't do it for this," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's why you deserve it." For a while, they sat in silence. The chaplain had stepped down from the podium. The sun was high now, casting long rays through the open-air canopy, making the edges of the flag shimmer in Ludacris's lap. He stared at the creases, each fold a step in a ritual he had witnessed many times but never received himself. The flag had been handled with precision and care, each triangle folded into the next like layers of memory tucked beneath the surface. He traced one of the creases with his finger and thought about all the things it held: Compton, Alabama, the porch visits, the quiet toasts, the moments that made their friendship real. He remembered a night in 1985 when Beckett had shown up unannounced, still in his uniform, with nothing but a six-pack and a bad joke. They had sat in silence that night, watching the stars. Beckett had been on the verge of another deployment, and something in his demeanor had felt heavier than usual. Ludacris had handed him a bottle, looked him square in the face, and said, "Don't carry it alone." Beckett hadn't replied. But when he left one of his medals behind, tucked into the wooden armrest of the porch chair. Ludacris had found it the next morning, smiled, and never said a word about it. That memory floated up now as if summoned by the stillness. Ludacris reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old armband again. The green was dull now, nearly brown from age, the threads of the initials, TB, fraying at the edges. He held it in his palm, resting it atop the flag, letting the two symbols of their bond sit together in the quiet. Rebecca glanced down and drew in a soft breath. "You still carry that?" she asked. "Everywhere," he said. "Wore it under my shirt the day he made general. Watched the ceremony on TV. Didn't say anything to anybody, but I had it on. Felt like I was there." Rebecca looked away for a moment, her eyes glistening. "He told me he wanted you there. Said it never felt right without you." Ludacris nodded. "I know," he said. He didn't have to say it. The last guests had now stood. A few were making their way toward the family to offer condolences. Others lingered near the casket. But no one spoke to Ludacris directly. They gave him space, not out of exclusion anymore, but out of reverence. He felt their eyes, not as judgment this time, but as recognition. Some nodded respectfully. A few removed their hats. One man placed his hand over his heart as he passed. Ludacris acknowledged none of them, not out of rudeness, but because he was still with Beckett. Still in the moment. Rebecca stood, straightening the edges of her black dress. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. Ludacris hesitated, then slowly rose, flag in one hand, armband folded and tucked back into his pocket. He offered her his other arm, and she took it without hesitation. They walked toward the casket together, each step measured, steady. When they reached it, Rebecca reached out and placed her fingers gently on the edge, her touch light, almost ceremonial. "He always said you were his better half," she said softly. Ludacris smiled faintly. We just saw the best in each other. They stood in silence, letting the moment linger. Then Rebecca stepped back, and Ludacris leaned forward, placing one hand on the casket again, not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. His lips moved in a whisper, but the words were only for Beckett. No one else needed to hear. When he stepped away, he turned to Rebecca and gave her a small nod. She returned it, and they began walking back toward the waiting crowd, arm in arm. As they moved past rows of now empty chairs and guests speaking in hushed tones, Ludacris felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt seen. And in that feeling was something else too. Not closure exactly. But peace. A quiet understanding that though history had nearly left him behind, love had not. Loyalty had not. And neither had the man he called brother. The folded flag rested in his arms, but it carried more than the memory of a soldier. It carried a bond built not in ceremony but in mud, in sweat, in promises kept across a lifetime. And as Ludacris and Rebecca walked side by side through the fading shadows of the ceremony, he knew that the story wasn't ending. It was finally being told. The sun had lowered slightly by the time the final handshakes were exchanged and the last guests drifted away. The honor guards had stepped back into formation and slowly dispersed. The rows of white chairs stood empty, shadows stretching long across the manicured grass. Ludacris remained near the casket, the flag still pressed close to his chest, his hands aching slightly from the grip. But he hadn't let go, and he wouldn't, not yet. Rebecca had left him alone for a moment, giving him space without needing to explain why. She understood. The kind of bond he and Beckett shared didn't end when the ceremony did. It lingered in the air like the smoke of a spent salute. And there was still one thing left to do. He walked slowly to a bench beneath a tree a short distance from the site, settling into the seat with care. The old armband was still in his pocket, but now there was something else. Another piece of fabric and ink that carried the weight of memory. Reaching into the inner lining of his blazer, he pulled out a thick envelope. It had been given to him weeks before, just after Beckett's passing, with no fanfare, just a simple note from Rebecca that read, "He wrote this for you." Ludacris hadn't opened it then. He hadn't felt ready. There were too many feelings still flooding him, too many moments echoing too loudly. But now, as the cemetery quieted and the wind rustled gently through the trees, he knew it was time. He broke the seal carefully, unfolding the trifolded pages with fingers that trembled despite his best effort to keep steady. The handwriting was familiar, a little shakier than it had once been, but still distinctly Beckett's, bold where it mattered, deliberate in every line. Ludacris. If you're reading this, it means I've gone on ahead, just like I always said I would. I know you don't care much for letters. You've always been more of a man who shows up than talks. But there are things I never had the courage to say in person, and I'm hoping you'll forgive me for saying them now, too late, the way men like us always seem to do. You saved my life more than once. Not just in Quantum, though God knows I'd have never walked out of that trench if not for you. But after, too. All those years I wore the uniform, gave speeches, led men, I was carrying your voice with me. The one that reminded me who I was before all the salutes and medals. You kept me grounded when the rest of the world tried to lift me somewhere I didn't always deserve to be. I've carried guilt about a lot of things. That I got the stars and you got the mop. That they put my name on the wall and forgot yours. That every time they read out my accomplishments, I let them, even though half of them were yours. And I should have said something. I should have told them. When I made brigadier, they gave me a choice, to pick who'd pin the stars. I almost chose the general who mentored me. It would have made sense. Would have looked good. But I thought about you instead. I thought about the rain in Quantum and the way you laughed in the middle of gunfire like the jungle wasn't swallowing us whole. I thought about the armband I gave you, the one I made with my own two hands because I didn't know how else to say I loved you like family. But I didn't have the guts. Not then. Not with cameras and officers watching. I didn't ask you to be there. And that's on me. I've never regretted anything more. I'm writing this now because I want you to know that you were always the better man. You didn't need a medal or a title to prove it. You carried your duty in your soul. You taught kids. You buried your wife with grace. You stood up for people who never saw you standing. You never once asked for recognition. But I see you. Always did. And I want you to have something. Not just the flag. That's for the public. But this letter, ludicrous, this is just for you. Because the truth is, if I ever stood tall, it was because you were behind me. If I ever made it home, it was because you carried me. I hope you forgive me for not saying it sooner. Thank you. For everything. Your brother. Tom. Ludacris sat motionless, the letter open in his lap, his eyes reading the words again even though he knew them by heart already. Each sentence felt like a flood, pouring over years of silence and sweeping away the doubts that had followed him through decades. The quiet confession of a man the world had celebrated, finally turned inward to acknowledge the one who made that celebration possible. A single tear slid down Ludacris's cheek. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just truth, traced in salt water. He wiped it with the back of his hand, slow and deliberate, then folded the letter with the same care he'd used to unfold it. He tucked it back into his blazer, near the armband, near his heart. The sun was dipping now, the shadows lengthening. But Ludacris didn't feel smaller in the twilight. He felt known. The ache that had sat in his chest since the day Beckett died, since the gate guards looked through him, since the first salute had ever passed him by, had loosened its grip. Beckett had seen him. Had always seen him. And now the world had too, if only for a moment. He looked out across the lawn, rows of white headstones catching the golden light. He wasn't afraid of death. Not anymore. When his time came, he knew who would be waiting. With a fishing rod, most likely, and that same smirk from their teenage years. But for now, he still had miles left to walk. He stood, slowly, but with strength, the flag folded once more in his hands, the letter tucked safe beneath his coat, and his friend's voice echoing not in the past, but in the present. Ludacris turned toward the long path back and began walking, steady as ever. Ludacris walked slowly back toward the quiet edge of the cemetery, the folded flag held against his chest like it had always belonged there. The letter in his blazer pocket felt warm from his body heat, as though Beckett's words had come alive the moment he read them. The sky had softened into a burnished hue of amber and rose, the kind of light that makes shadows stretch and everything feel like it's part of a memory. Each step he took on the stone path echoed gently beneath his feet, not loud, but enough to remind him he was still present, still walking, still holding on to something that had outlived nearly everyone they had served with. He passed a few groundskeepers beginning to clear the area, nodding politely as they moved chairs and collected small programs from the grass. No one stopped him. No one asked who he was anymore. That moment had passed, and in its place was something like reverence. He reached a small bench under a dogwood tree, its white petals fluttering in the breeze, and eased himself down with a tired sigh. The wind carried the faintest scent of grass and spring blossoms, and for a moment he closed his eyes. He had told himself he wasn't going to cry. Not today. Not in front of all those people. Not with medals gleaming and flags flying and generals saluting. But now, in the hush that followed, when no one was watching and the weight of what had been written still pressed against his heart, he felt the tear slip before he even realized it had formed. It slid down the side of his face and caught in the crease of his jaw. He didn't wipe it away immediately. He let it stay. Let it be what it was. Real. He hadn't cried when his father passed, a strong man who had worked himself into the ground and taught Ludacris the meaning of duty without ever calling it that. He hadn't cried when his wife slipped away in her sleep, her hands folded neatly over her stomach like she had simply chosen peace. He hadn't cried when he lost the house to the storm or when he buried his best student after a street fight took him too soon. But now, for this, for the letter, for the man who had remembered what the world forgot, he cried. The letter had done something that years of medals and folded flags had never managed. It had spoken the truth. Not for the world, but for him. Beckett's confession, that he had wanted Ludacris to be the one to pin on the stars, that he had thought of him every time a speech was made, every time a ceremony passed without his name, had cracked open a place Ludacris had sealed shut long ago. Not out of bitterness, but out of survival. He had learned to live without being seen. Without being acknowledged. He had told himself it didn't matter. That love didn't need headlines. That friendship wasn't diminished just because it wasn't photographed. But it did matter. Not for pride. Not for recognition. But because silence, when it lasts too long, can start to feel like erasure. And now, Beckett's words had shattered that silence. The letter was not just a thank you. It was an apology. And in its pages, Ludacris found a piece of himself he didn't know he had lost. He reached into his blazer again, carefully unfolding the letter one more time, letting his eyes trace the curves of Beckett's handwriting. He read it slowly, savoring every word. Especially the line that lingered above all else, "If I ever stood tall, it was because you were behind me." That was it. That was everything. That was the reason Ludacris had never needed applause, but had always needed to be remembered. Not as a hero. But as part of the story. He folded the letter again, this time with even more care, and placed it back into his coat pocket. He leaned back against the bench and looked up at the sky. The clouds had begun to shift, stretching in thin strands across the horizon, streaks of gold threading through soft gray. He could hear birds settling in the branches above, their songs light and tentative. Footsteps approached softly on the gravel path. Ludacris turned his head and saw Rebecca walking toward him, her heels quiet against the stones. She carried a small envelope in her hand and a look on her face that mirrored the same quiet strength she had shown all day. "I found this in Tom's things," she said, offering the envelope. "He started it but never finished. It's addressed to you." Ludacris took the envelope carefully, opened it, and read the single line inside. "You were never second, Ludacris. You were always the reason I came home." He stared at the page, his breath caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The ink was faded at the end, as if Beckett's hand had trembled or the pen had run dry. Maybe he had intended to write more. Maybe that was all he needed to say. Either way, it was enough. Rebecca sat beside him on the bench, her hands clasped in her lap. "He didn't say it often," she said, "but he always believed that the most important things in life aren't spoken in speeches. They're carried. Lived. Like what you did." Ludacris nodded. "I just kept showing up. That's what he admired most about you," she said. "That you never stopped." For a moment, they sat in silence together, watching the world move gently around them. The grounds were almost empty now, the last few guests driving away, their engines humming softly down the hill. The flag still rested in Ludacris's lap. The armband and letters pressed against his chest. And beside him, the only person who had ever truly understood what Beckett meant when he said brother. Ludacris exhaled slowly and said, "I think I'm ready now." Rebecca looked at him. "To go?" He shook his head. "To finally let it in." She smiled gently, placed her hand over his, and said, "Then let it in." And for the first time in a long, long while, Ludacris did. The wind settled as Ludacris stood once more, the folded flag in one arm, the half-finished letter from Beckett resting just above his heart. Rebecca remained seated on the bench beneath the tree, watching him with a softness that spoke more than any farewell could. Her eyes followed him not with worry but with understanding. She knew where he was going and why. Some journeys didn't need words. They only needed presence. He walked slowly back toward the casket, the crowd long gone, the silence around him so complete that even the birds seemed to pause. The afternoon sun, low now in the sky, cast warm light over the grass, gilding the stones with gold. Every step felt heavy and full, as though the very ground beneath his feet knew what was about to happen. When he reached the casket, he stopped and placed the flag gently on the stand beside it, not as a gesture of letting go, but as an offering. He kept one hand resting on the wood for a long moment, his fingers spread wide, his shoulders straight. He closed his eyes. The memories didn't just return, they flooded him. The sound of Beckett's laugh echoing off the metal walls of a tent, the look on his face when he returned from a patrol with a new scar and a grin that dared the world to challenge him. The two of them sitting on Ludacris's porch, beer bottle sweating in the Alabama heat, the night full of fireflies and the unspoken gratitude of surviving. He opened his eyes and leaned in slightly, his voice soft but clear enough to be heard by the wind and whatever might still linger between them. "Tom," he began, "I told myself I wouldn't talk too long, but I guess that ship's already sailed." He gave a faint smile, then exhaled slowly. "You remember that summer in '55? We went fishing on Taylor Creek. You forgot the rods, I forgot the bait. We sat there for 5 hours catching nothing but heat, swearing we'd never tell a soul." He paused, blinking against the burn in his eyes. "But we laughed. God, we laughed so hard, I thought my ribs would crack." He lowered his voice, but his tone deepened. "I never said it right before. Probably because I didn't know how. But I loved you like my own blood. You weren't just a friend. You were my family. The best part of it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old armband one final time. He unfolded it carefully, smoothed the worn fabric, and held it in both hands. "I carried this for over 50 years, he said. "Not because I needed proof of anything. But because it reminded me that even in the worst of it, we still had each other. This little piece of cloth got me through more nights than I can count." He stood in silence for a moment, the armband lying flat across his palms. Then, without another word, he leaned forward and laid it gently atop the casket, just above the folded corner of the larger flag. His fingers lingered there, pressed to the wood. "I always thought we'd go out together," he said. "Side by side, gray and slow, arguing about whose knees were worse or who left the grill on." His throat caught. "But here we are. And you made it. And somehow, so did I." He stepped back, standing tall again. "I'll be all right," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll keep walking. Like I always have. But I won't forget. I can't." The sunlight hit his face, and he turned toward it, letting it warm the lines of age carved deep into his skin. He looked down at the casket once more. "You rest now," he said. "You've earned it. And for once, I'll say it out loud. I'm proud of you." He stayed there a moment longer, then slowly stepped back. His hand raised instinctively in a final salute, the movement not perfect but full of everything he had left. His elbow shook slightly, his fingers not quite straight, but it was a salute not of duty, but of love. The kind you don't give lightly. The kind you carry forever. From behind him came the faint crunch of gravel under boots. He didn't turn until he heard a voice. "Detail, attention." It rang out crisp, echoing across the quiet grounds like thunder after stillness. Ludacris turned. A group of younger soldiers had returned, standing now in quiet formation just a few paces away. One of them, perhaps the same young man who had saluted him earlier, stepped forward, eyes locked on Ludacris. Without hesitation, the entire detail raised their hands in salute, holding it firmly as the moment unfolded. Ludacris stood frozen. Not in fear. Not in confusion. But in something deeper, pride, disbelief, gratitude, all mingling into something too large for words. He slowly returned the salute, nodding once as he did. This time, there were no gate guards blocking his way, no list to be checked, no question of belonging. In this moment, in this hallowed place, he was more than welcome. He was recognized. When the salute ended, the air held for a second longer, as if unwilling to release what had just passed between them. The young soldier stepped forward again and extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Delroy," he said. "For everything." Ludacris took the hand, shook it firmly, then gave a quiet smile. "Thank you," he replied, "for seeing me." As they stepped back and began to depart, Ludacris turned once more to the casket. He whispered one final word that was not for anyone else, just for the man beneath the flag, the boy from the neighborhood, the soldier in the trench, the brother in every way that mattered. "Goodbye." And with that, he turned toward the path and began walking away, the sound of his footsteps soft but certain, echoing like the slow beat of a drum carrying memory forward. Each step carried a lifetime. Each step said, "I was here. I am still here." The sun had dropped lower, and the golden haze had given way to a softer amber light as Ludacris exited the cemetery's southern gate. The street was mostly quiet now, just a few cars crawling by and a scattering of pedestrians returning to the rhythm of a normal day. But nothing about Ludacris felt normal. Not after what had happened. Not after that salute. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, his knees aching but steady, holding a folded letter in one hand and the memories of an entire lifetime in the other. He didn't speak to anyone as he walked. He didn't have to. Every person who passed him either offered a glance or stepped aside without a word. Some recognized him, others didn't. But in Ludacris's heart, he carried a peace that made explanations unnecessary. Back at his hotel, a modest place tucked near a metro line in Arlington, Ludacris stepped into the cool air of the lobby and gave a small nod to the clerk. The young woman behind the counter looked up, eyes widening. "You're him," she said. Ludacris paused, unsure what she meant. "From the funeral today. My cousin sent me a video. The general stopped everything for you. That was real powerful." Ludacris gave her a kind smile. "Yes, ma'am. It was real." She hesitated, then stepped around the counter. "Would you mind if I shook your hand?" He chuckled softly. "You don't need to ask permission to do what's right," he said, offering his hand. She took it carefully, like she was touching something fragile and sacred at the same time. "Thank you for your service," she said. Ludacris simply nodded. Back in his room, he sank slowly into the chair beside the window. The folded flag rested on the bed, its edges perfect, its symbolism immeasurable. He held the letter again, rereading the final lines in Beckett's hand. He didn't cry this time. He just sat with it. Let it settle deeper into his bones. It had been the kind of day that rewrote decades of silence. That kind of day doesn't need to be rushed. The knock on the door was gentle but firm. Ludacris rose slowly, opened it, and found Rebecca standing there with her son. Theodore, tall and quiet like his father, gave him a short respectful nod. "I hope we're not disturbing," Rebecca said. "We just wanted to check on you." Ludacris stepped aside and waved them in. "You're always welcome." They came in, and Rebecca's eyes immediately found the flag. She moved closer, touching it lightly. "He would have been so proud to see this moment," she said. Ludacris gave a small smile. "He always said you were the one who got the sense in the family. He was just stubborn enough to survive war." They sat together for a while. No television, no noise, just the three of them in quiet company. Theodore broke the silence. "There's something else," he said. "A journalist reached out to us. Someone who was at the funeral. She saw what happened with the general. Says people need to hear your story." Ludacris raised his eyebrows. "What for? Ain't no medals to hand out. Ain't no war left to win." Rebecca placed a hand on his. "Because stories like yours remind people what sacrifice looks like. What brotherhood means. And what dignity can do when it's walked out humbly." Ludacris looked down, thoughtful. He had never wanted attention. But this wasn't about him. Not really. It was about truth. About Tom. About finally honoring something the world had missed for far too long. The next day, the interview happened at a local cafe. The journalist, a woman in her early 40s named Mia, had a voice that invited trust. She asked thoughtful questions, never poking, never prodding. Ludacris told her about Tuskegee, about the mill houses, about the way he and Tom used to race bottle caps in the rain gutters after summer storms. He told her about Compton, about the trench, about the mud and smoke and the purple flare that saved 2 lives. And he told her about the long walk up to the funeral gate, the envelope in his coat, and the voice that said, "You're not on the list." When he finished, she didn't speak for a long while. Then she said, "Do you mind if I share this publicly?" Ludacris nodded. "If it helps one person understand what we carried, then it's worth it." The article published 2 days later. The man who wasn't on the list, a salute long overdue. It went viral within hours. Photos of the funeral, the image of General Callister halting the ceremony to walk toward the gate, the folded flag, the armband, everything was captured with reverence. Thousands of comments poured in. Veterans from every war since Vietnam wrote to say thank you. Children reposted the photo of Ludacris and called him a national treasure. Teachers read the article aloud in classrooms. And somewhere in a town Ludacris would never visit, a boy who looked like him stared at the screen and whispered, "That could be me." Ludacris didn't care for all the noise, but he did appreciate the letters. Especially the one written in pencil on lined paper from a 3rd grader in Ohio. It simply said, "Dear Mr. Delroy, I'm glad the general stopped. You're a hero. I want to be like you. Love, Marcus." He pinned it to the fridge in his apartment when he returned home. He didn't tell many people about the article. He didn't have to. Folks knew. People in the grocery store started offering to carry his bags. Teenagers said, "Yes sir," without being told. At the church on Sunday, the pastor invited him to speak. Ludacris declined. But when the choir sang, "Precious Lord," he stood up and bowed his head. Because sometimes, the most powerful things are said in silence. The story of Ludacris and Tom Beckett was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to a nation reminded of something it had almost forgotten, that honor doesn't come from titles or gates or lists. It comes from showing up, holding steady, and loving someone enough to carry them through fire. The morning air buzzed with a different kind of energy now. It had been over a week since the funeral, and the story of Ludacris Delroy had taken on a life of its own. What began as a private moment between a soldier and a fallen friend had swept across the country like a spark through dry brush. News anchors quoted his words. Veterans halls hung up his picture. Church bulletins mentioned him in prayer lists. But Ludacris, now back in his modest home in Birmingham, found himself more at peace sweeping his front porch than speaking into microphones. He had lived his life avoiding spectacle. Still, sometimes you don't choose the spotlight, it finds you. That Tuesday, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of his house just after noon. Ludacris had just finished folding laundry and was about to sit down for lunch. He saw the vehicle and sighed, already guessing what was coming. When the knock came, it was sharp but respectful. He opened the door to find a tall man in a dark blazer and a woman with a large camera bag standing beside him. "Mr. Delroy?" the man asked. "I'm Alan Timmons with WDS News Network. This is our producer, Meredith. We were hoping we could speak with you. Off the record first, if that's all right." Ludacris looked at them, not unkindly, but with that measured weight in his eyes that said he had seen far more in life than they ever would. "You hungry?" he asked. They looked surprised. "We just put on some chicken and greens," Ludacris continued. "You can talk while we eat." Within minutes they were seated at his worn kitchen table, the smell of collard greens and cornbread filling the space. Meredith whispered to Alan, "This is better than any studio." Alan nodded in agreement, tapping gently on his phone to start a voice memo. Ludacris spoke slowly at first. He wasn't used to being interviewed, and he didn't like to repeat himself. But as the camera stayed off and the food warmed the room, his words found their flow. He told them about Langston High School, about the kids who passed through those halls, the ones who stayed after class to help him mop or who told him their dreams when no one else would listen. He shared stories about Beckett, not the military stuff at first, but the human parts. "Tom once convinced me to join a talent show," Ludacris said with a chuckle. He couldn't sing worth nothing, but he wanted to do a Motown medley. "I told him we were gonna embarrass ourselves. He said, we're already two broke kids and hand-me-downs, ain't no lower to fall. We didn't win. But we had people dancing." Alan leaned in. "Why do you think your story touched so many people, Mr. Delroy?" Ludacris looked out the window a moment before answering. "Because it ain't really my story. It's about remembering. It's about showing up for someone even when nobody sees you. About loving somebody like they're your own blood. We all want to believe someone would walk through fire for us. That day at the cemetery, that was just me saying I'd do it again. That was the line that made the evening broadcast. I'd do it again." The clip aired that night on national television, and something about Ludacris's calm, weathered voice stirred something deep in the country's heart. Social media exploded again. Artists painted portraits of him. Students quoted him in essays. A jazz musician even wrote a song called "The Man at the Gate." It played soft and slow, with a trumpet that wept through the bridge. The next morning, a mail truck delivered 3 boxes full of letters. Handwritten notes, cards, drawings from kids, even a few medals from soldiers who wanted him to have theirs. Ludacris sat on his porch, reading one at a time, his glasses slipping down his nose. Some he kept. Some he mailed back with a short thank you. Most he placed gently in a wooden box labeled Tom. One afternoon, the mayor of Birmingham called. "Mr. Delroy," she said, "we'd like to recognize you at our city's Veterans Day ceremony this year." The city council voted unanimously. "We'd be honored." Ludacris chuckled. "You want me to get up in front of folks and say something nice about war?" She paused, unsure how to respond. "No ma'am," he continued, "I'll do it. But I ain't giving no Hollywood speech. I'll talk about a porch in Alabama. About a boy who wore his daddy's boots too big and a friend who laughed at every one of his mistakes." He wasn't bitter about the attention. But he remained grounded. Whenever reporters tried to spin him into a hero, he corrected them. "Tom was the hero," he'd say. "I just ran fast that day." Still, as November crept closer and the leaves turned bronze, Ludacris began to realize something was shifting. People weren't just celebrating a man, they were reclaiming a piece of lost history. He had become a symbol of honor that had been overlooked too many times in the past. And in that realization, something stirred in him. Something that said, maybe now's the time to tell the whole truth. He sat down at his kitchen table one evening with a pen and a blank pad of paper. No cameras, no crowds, just the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of wind outside. He began to write. Not just about Vietnam, but about everything. His childhood. His first job. His love for his wife, Bernice. The day he found out she was sick. The moment she died and the silence afterward that nearly swallowed him whole. He wrote about how some nights, the only thing that kept him from falling apart was the weight of Beckett's letter, still tucked in his coat. By the time he looked up, the page was full. And he knew there'd be more. Not for the world, not yet, but for himself. For Tom. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from being seen. It comes from saying what was never said. The letter came in a plain manila envelope with no markings other than his name, printed neatly in black ink. Ludacris Delroy sat at his kitchen table as usual, a cup of warm tea in front of him and the morning sun cutting across the worn wood. The handwriting on the return address was unfamiliar, but the postmark said, Pentagon. That alone made him hesitate. He ran a finger along the seam of the envelope, his thumb catching the adhesive before he finally opened it. Inside was a single page on Department of Defense letterhead. It was stiff, formal, and heavy with intent. It started with, Mr. Delroy, after a review of recently declassified service records and first-hand testimony, the Department of Defense is proud to recognize your heroic actions during the Quantum Valley ambush of June 1968. He didn't need to read further to know what it meant. For decades, he'd brushed off Beckett's quiet efforts to recommend him for a medal. Ludacris never asked, never pressed, and certainly never chased it. But Tom had tried, back then, with a shaky hand and a typewriter ribbon running dry. Tom Beckett had written about a young man who carried him out of a trench with a bullet in his gut and enemy fire so close it left powder burns on his gear. But somewhere along the way, the request had gone missing, buried, or ignored. Until now. They were offering him the Silver Star. Ludacris leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. He read the letter again, slower this time. The commendation felt like both an honor and a ghost. It brought memories with it, blood-soaked fatigues, the weight of Tom's body slung over his shoulders, the tang of gunpowder and adrenaline. He could still hear the jungle screaming, and the broken radio, and Beckett's voice gritted with pain. Now, 57 years later, they wanted to recognize it. He walked to the mantel, where the folded flag sat encased in glass, and beside it, the old armband with the letters, TB, stitched in green. A photo of the two of them, muddy, laughing, was propped next to it. Ludacris rested a hand on the mantel and stared for a long while. He didn't feel pride or vindication. He felt still. As if time had briefly held its breath to nod at something long overdue. That afternoon, he called Rebecca Beckett. Her voice warmed instantly when she heard his. Ludacris, I was just thinking about you, she said. You watching the news? They're still running your speech at the cemetery. My neighbor's son wants to be you for Veterans Day. Ludacris chuckled. They're sending me a medal, he said quietly. She paused. The one Tom put in for Silver Star. She was silent for a long beat. Then came a soft, broken exhale. I wish he could see this. He does, Ludacris replied. The Pentagon offered to fly him to Washington for the ceremony. Full honors. They said a general would pin it on him personally, in front of press and family. Ludacris said no. He didn't need the pomp. Instead, he asked if they'd consider sending the medal to Birmingham, to Langston High, where he'd worked all those years. If there's gonna be a ceremony, he said, let it be where I knew the real fight was. And so it was arranged. A week later, the school gymnasium was filled with students, teachers, alumni, and veterans. The old wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of a packed crowd. Streamers hung along the railings. A banner read, "Welcome home, Mr. Delroy." Some of the kids didn't fully understand who he was, but they knew he had done something brave. They knew he mattered. That was enough. Ludacris stood at the podium, wearing the same brown wool blazer he had worn to the funeral. The same shoes, freshly shined. He looked out over the crowd and smiled. When I started mopping these floors, he began, I never thought anyone'd ask me to stand here. I didn't come for recognition. I came because I believed in what this place stood for. I believed every one of you deserved a clean place to learn. A safe place. A little bit of dignity. He paused, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the medal. It glinted under the gym lights, more silver than he expected. The room held its breath. This medal, he said, holding it up, ain't about me. It's about a moment. One moment when I saw someone I loved bleeding, and I didn't think, I just moved. That's what love does. That's what duty does. And maybe, if we all lived our lives that way, we'd see fewer names carved into marble. He handed the medal to the principal. Put it in the display case next to the school's history awards. Remind the kids it ain't always about winning. Sometimes, it's about showing up. The crowd stood, clapping hard and long. Some wiped tears from their eyes. A few saluted. Others simply nodded, as if their souls had been quietly touched. Later, as the room emptied, a young boy approached him. 10, maybe 11. Eyes wide behind thick glasses. "Mr. Delroy," he said, "my dad's in the Navy. He told me what you did. I want to be brave like that." Ludacris crouched down and smiled. "You don't need a war to be brave, son. Just speak the truth. Do what's right, even when it's hard. Help somebody. That's more than enough." He stood again, his joints protesting, but his heart light. The day felt full. And he didn't need applause. What he needed was already in the letter, in the folded flag, in the memory of a man who'd called him brother without ever needing to say the word. The porch light flickered as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden haze across Ludacris Delroy's modest Birmingham home. The air smelled of jasmine and freshly cut grass, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the magnolia tree by the fence. Ludacris sat on his porch, that same worn wooden bench beneath him, sipping from a chipped mug of sweet tea. He leaned back slowly, his eyes scanning the street with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just any evening, it was the first one where he truly felt like something had come full circle. Across the street, Mrs. Hargrove's grandchildren chased fireflies while she called out reminders about supper. Down the block, Mr. Patterson watered his lawn, pausing occasionally to wave at passing cars. It was a quiet life, but Ludacris had come to understand that the quiet held a kind of strength the world often overlooked. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the old folded photo. Him and Tom Beckett in their youth, muddy and grinning in that faraway jungle. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the memory was bright as ever. He held it between his fingers a moment, then tucked it back into the inside flap of his Bible, now permanently resting on the side table next to the folded flag. That flag, once presented to him by Rebecca, remained untouched since the ceremony. It wasn't in a case, wasn't displayed for guests. It simply sat there, like a sacred promise never needing to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, in the soft hush of evening, he'd look at it and smile, not because of the honor it symbolized, but because of the friendship it immortalized. The screen door creaked open behind him. Theodore Beckett, Tom's son, stepped out with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "Turkey and Swiss," he said, offering one to Ludacris with a grin. "Thought you might be hungry." Ludacris accepted it with a nod. "You still remember what I like. That's dangerous. Makes a man think you're fixing to move in." Theodore laughed as he sat beside him. "Wouldn't be the worst thing," he said. "I like the peace out here. World feels kinder when you're on this porch." Ludacris took a bite, chewing slowly, then looked out at the dimming sky. "You remember the first time you came here after the war? You were just a boy. Had your daddy's stubborn chin." "I remember," Theodore said softly. "You looked at me like you already knew who I was." "I did," Ludacris said. "You were the piece of Tom he left behind. I didn't have no children of my own, but looking at you back then, it felt like maybe I still had family." Theodore nodded, swallowing hard, his eyes glassing slightly. "He talked about you every chance he got, you know. Said you were the kind of man who never needed a spotlight to shine." "That's 'cause spotlights make you sweat," Ludacris muttered with a small chuckle. "I was fine with a mop and a hallway. Didn't need more than that." "But you gave more," Theodore said, his voice firm now. "To this community. To my father. To me. That silver star. That's not just a medal, it's a mirror. It reflects what kind of man you are." Ludacris looked down at his hands, still calloused despite the years. "Funny thing about mirrors," he said. "They don't show you what's inside. That comes out when no one's looking." That day in Quantum, I didn't think about medals or mirrors. Just knew I wasn't leaving Tom behind. Silence hung gently between them for a moment, broken only by the low chirp of crickets and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Ludacris sipped the last of his tea, then set the mug aside. I never said it properly, he said. But I loved your daddy like my own blood. And when he passed, something in me got quiet. He knew, Theodore replied. He carried your picture in his wallet until the day he died. Told me once, after a long silence, that if it weren't for you, there'd be no Beckett family at all. Ludacris inhaled slowly, letting that truth settle deep in his chest. He turned toward Theodore and nodded. Thank you for telling me that. They sat there for a while longer, sharing stories, some funny, some hard, most unfinished. Eventually, Theodore stood, stretching his legs. You need anything before I go? Yeah, Ludacris said, looking out over the street again. Just keep coming by. I will, Theodore promised. He stepped down off the porch, then paused at the bottom step. You know, they want to name a wing at the high school after you. Ludacris chuckled, waving a hand. Tell Em to name it after the janitor. Not the soldier. That's the man who showed up every day. As Theodore disappeared into the night, Ludacris leaned back once more, the slats of the bench pressing into his back, grounding him. A faint hum of gospel music played from a nearby house, a melody as familiar as breath. The porch light flickered again, then glowed steady, casting a gentle halo around him. He looked up at the stars beginning to pierce the sky and whispered softly, Rest easy, Tom. I kept walking. Just like I promised. And in that moment, beneath the Alabama sky, with the world finally still, Ludacris Delroy smiled. Not because the world had finally recognized him, but because, at last, he had nothing left to prove. Only memories to cherish and a porch to sit on, with the light always left on for those who remembered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?